Hi everyone, today fingerless mittens or gloves. For convenience I call them mittens, and also a possibility to add a thumb. Made with a true knit and a rib stitch, and the rib stitch is at the beginning and at the end. This is a way to make fingerless mittens, and I will be happy to show you how I did it. The link to the pattern in which you can follow almost verbatim what is told here in the video to increase the rib stitch and the main stitch you will find below this video. The nice thing about making these mittens is that you can make them just as big or small as you like. You can, like here, use charts to use a duplicate stitch, and once you found your size with the right stitch and yarn, you notice that it's also fun to apply all kinds of variations. Here you see, for example, a variation in the stitches. Same yarn, one strand, and then you'll see that it immediately becomes a size smaller. The pattern goes out approximately from size medium to extra large. I think everyone will fit that one then. You put 24 stitches on a loom, on 24 packs loom. You knit 6 rows in rib stitch and you knit 19 rows of true knit. And you either write that down or count the numbers of ridges as I show here. So tally, or use a row counter, or you just count the amount of ridges until you have reached the packs. Then at some point you are going to add this thumb. You knit your first 5 stitches, and that's because of the tension, because you're about to remove 3 stitches, otherwise you loop your stitches gigantic. I use an help needle here, but you can also put them on a strand or any other attribute you have. So you put 3 stitches on an help needle and you won't knit them anymore for some rows. So this becomes the thumb part, and through by the way of increasing, we are actually going to create a kind of hole or a gap for the thumb. I'm going to knit 2 rows back and forth here. That will be big enough for my thumb. But of course you might also have to knit an extra 4 rows here. That's the nicest thing about this one, because you knit it yourself. You can adjust it to any size. Well, row 1, you knit to the second last stitch of this row, and by making a wrap on this pack you will create space to be able to increase a stitch in the next row. You knit the first stitch of the second row. Look closely at your tension, and you hold the working yarn as well, and you move that stitch one peg to the left. You take the wrap and put it around the peg, and then you knit the stitch. This can sometimes take some effort to knit over the stitch, and you continue to knit the row. And I'm now wrapping the wrap from the right side of the peg, but at the part in this video where I'm demonstrating the thumb part, you will notice that I do the wrap from the other side, so from the left side of the peg, and it creates even fewer holes. You continue knitting the second row up to your second last stitch, and this one will have an extra wrap as well, so you can make an increase in your third row as well. In total you actually knit 3 rows to create a thumb hole. Okay, your second last peg. You knit it and you put a wrap around it. You knit your first stitch of the next row. You adjust your tension. You grab your wrap, put the wrap around the peg, and you knit the stitch. And just because of the tension, I'm doing my increases every new row, so not at the beginning and at the end. And if it's hard to knit over, you can also put your knit hook through the stitch on the back. I will demonstrate it later on in the video, and you knit the whole row again. So from now on we will knit in the round again. We continue knitting in the round again. So as you can see here, there will be still one empty back, and by giving it a kind of cast on stitch, you will connect your left and right side again. And you do this with a double E-wrap cast on. So you wrap your back twice, you knit over and adjust your tension, because otherwise you will get loops over there, and you will continue to knit for the hand part. For this mitten I had used 3 stitches for the thumb, because I had done this one, and which you see here, with 2 stitches, and it turned out to be tight for me. So then you put 2 stitches on the help needle and then you knit the thumb part. Basically the pattern remains the same, so also the increases. This one is with 3 stitches, and then you can also see, you sew it, do it later, so that it actually flow or merge neatly into each other, as if you had knitted it that way, even without sewing. Now just to show you the difference, I knitted this mitt in flat knit, and the other one was true knit. And this one is with 1 strand, and the other one is with 2 strands. So now you see this stitch is a bit airy, to put it that way. Then you actually see the holes around the thumb part getting bigger because of those increases. They are made on the same loom, 2 strands, that's the pink one, and the other one is 1 strand. So you could adjust the one I did with 1 strand by grabbing a thicker yarn or a thicker stitch, and then you also have less holes. You also see that the brim part, you have to pay attention to that. Here it is still a bit on the outside. It's also done on a 24 loom, that you adjust your brim to the stitch which you use as main stitch. And if you don't have an adjustable loom, then you're limited to those 24 stitches, and you can't do more than that, because you know, of course, your wrist is also a bit narrower than the part of your hand. And then you also have to find out which loom is the best for a person's mitten. For example, for a man's hand you might have to use 31, and as you can see here, my wrist is a lot smaller than my hand part. So which looms comes near to the right size for both wrist and hand. So for me this is a real fun project, and I might want to try it on the flexi as well. But even without a flexi you can make a very nice project out of it on a 24 loom. It's often the case that you only have to make 1 mitt, and then you have a kind of basic which functions for all the other mittens you are going to knit on this one. But you can also play with your stitches and your yarn on this loom, and then you can actually make a fit mitt for or on it, and then you don't even need another loom to accomplish that. Meanwhile, I've knitted 10 rows of true knit from the thumb part, and then 6 rows rib stitch, and I'm almost ready with the casting off of the mitt. So you can keep track of that by doing some counting rows or tally, and your method of keeping up track. And if you lost track, just look from the gap to the first stitch you find, and then you count your ridges from there. If you always do that the same way, you will get identical mittens as well. And here I've used a way of casting off where I let the loom do the job. Then I get a nice and even cast off edge, so to speak. All the methods that are shown here. You can see them in the document on Revelry. There you'll see links to the videos, which are also on this channel. Okay, then you cast off your last stitch and grab your scissors. You cut off your strand long enough and you loop the stitch. And now, the most important thing. It's still inside out. You turn it back and then you give the stitch the right tension. And in this case, you have used the rib stitch. And with this stitch, you actually do that stitch by stitch. So every stitch is stretched out. And usually after a day the stitch has the right tension. So you're actually modeling your project here. So, and after modeling your project, we move on, we continue to the thumb. And now I have used 3 stitches for the thumb. And if you do this for the first time, I advise you put your stitches back on and then put a lifeline in. If it is too wide or too narrow, the thumb part, you can still adjust it. And then it's also easier to put the stitches back on the loom, because you can also play with that thumb part in terms of length and width. The mitt is knitted in a knit stitch, and so if you're going to put it back, you don't want to have a twisted stitch, so you put it back as a knit stitch. You make sure it's not twisted. So very gently, and if necessary you just put it back on your knit hook from the needle. With your hook you can often maneuver a little better around the head of the peg, and then you can use that head, the top of the peg, to open the stitch. And also make sure both strands, if you knit with 2 strands, are back on the peg. And then you can actually use the back piece, like you see here, of the stitch. You grab that ridge to open the stitch. And then you are going to attach your skein. Advice: take a longer strand to start. You can use it later to close the thumb. It will save you a knot over there. The less knots you have, the better. The strand that comes out of your skein, that will go into your knit direction. You hold those 2 strands and then you knit over, and you knit your first row. And from now until 11 stitches each time at the end of the row on your second last peg, you make a wrap, so you can use it in your next row to increase. Actually, it works here just like you did with your thumb part. Normally, when knitting, you would increase 2 on one side. So you actually increase 2 stitches on both sides. Only with this loom you get holes, or it takes a lot of effort to increase the stitch. So I'm going to increase every time at the beginning of the row. And this is more beautiful. And to make that increase, in the row before the increase, you wrap around the peg on your second last. So you knit your first stitch, you adjust your tension there, and you move it 1 peg further. You hold the strand and then you grab the wrap you made in the previous row, and you can do that from this side. But to get a nice wrap or increase stitch here, turn the stitch from the left side around your peg and you knit the stitch. And this stitch can be hard to knit over. You can use your strand you're holding as a kind of leverage, and if you can't, knit it over, and because it's important that you keep your tension right here, you can also use your knit hook. You put that one in the knit stitch or in the stitch on the peg to put it back on, and you correct your tension again. Keep on checking what's happening behind those pegs. and then you knit the rest of the stitches. Make sure this one, the one you casted on, that it can't be looped through, because otherwise you're going to have to adjust it later on. Oops, I'm knitting my last stitch, but I have to make a wrap over here, so I knit backwards, make my wrap, and knit my last stitch of that row. You check your tension again. You may pull at your strand, and this one may come off again. You knit your first stitch, you move it one peg. In this way the space is going to be created. Correct your tension again, look carefully between the two pegs, and otherwise it's the intermediate stitch between peg 1 and 2 if you lose it. And then you grab it again and you put the stitch gently on the peg. With certain yarns that are less elastic, you will notice that it's sometimes difficult to knit that stitch. So for everything is a solution. So you just grab that stitch again and you knit it, or you wrap it and then knit it. And if it is hard, just pull your hook in the stitch or through the stitch on the peg. You hold the stitch and yarn, and then you knit it over like this. You will notice that it will be a little easier then. Everything is for the right tension. It can also be because of the loom, that the heads of the pegs are just a little too round or too big, and then you just have to do it this way, in a gentle way. The looser you do this part, the bigger the stitches get here, so that's also a thing you have to take notice of. Wrap on the last, on the second last peg, you knit your last stitch and you are going to the next row. You knit your first stitch again, you move it one peg further, you adjust your tension, you grab your wrap, left around the peg, right as possible, but from the left your twist will be different. It is a little harder to put it back on the peg, but if necessary, you take another knit hook, that doesn't matter, or you do it from another side of the peg, so you turn your loom around. Especially in the beginning it's a bit tricky, I've noticed myself. And at a certain point you just wrap the stitch, the new stitch, around like this. And then you knit the stitch. If you can't manage, then you just very gently use your knit hook and you put them back on. And you adjust the tension between stitch 1 and 2 again. And this is also a rather small stitch, so that's why you have to make a little more effort to knit the stitch. You continue knitting with your main stitch and then through knit, and knit smoothly until you reach your second last peg. You knit that one, you create your wrap, and you knit your last stitch. Then you continue to the next increase, and what I said about a twist, you can do it from the left, you can do it from the right. If you do it from this side, from the left, actually you get the same kind of increase as you would have with the needles. So it's also a choice you can make. Have you lost track of how many rows you've knitted in the meantime? Then you rotate your loom, and then you count how many rows you've knitted by now, and that's 1, 2, 3, and up to the peg. Well, the intention is to increase to 11 stitches, or the stitches you need. The number of rows you knit for the thumb, of course, also depends on the person you knit your mitt for. Then it's the best, and that's because of the rib stitch. That's an even stitch, the rib stitch, that if you start with a knit stitch, then you also end with a knit stitch. And that's a beautiful way when you have to sew it, because then you have two of the same stitches on both sides. So then you knit to the point. You say, from here I'll do the knit rows and I continue 4 to 6 rows with a rib stitch. and ending with a rib stitch, because I don't want to have a curl at the end of my thumb, but that's also indicated in the pattern, so you can read it as well. Now we are still working on that knit stitch, and if you increase from 10 to 11 stitches, then you knit your first stitch a knit stitch. So you move it and you have a knit stitch over there, and then the second, the one you wrap, is the stitch that will be a purl stitch, and then you continue knitting your row in rib stitch, and then you should finish with a knit stitch if all goes well. You continue knitting in rib stitch, in my case a U-wrap and a purl, so U-wrap as a knit stitch. The main stitch was a true knit, and a U-wrap knit stitch is just a fraction smaller than a true knit, and then your rim also becomes a little smaller, and that dissolves nicely compared to the main stitch, so it's better in comparison to the main stitch. And after that first row rib stitch, you continue in rib stitch, and then at some point you get to the point that you have cast it off, and then you are going to weave in ends on the thumb part. The first thing you do, of course, is to stretch the stitch into the right tension, and then you can loop through stitches already. Solve any holes beforehand before you put it together. And here's your cast on strand. It's still loose here, and you adjust it to the rest of the stitches, and then you are going to use it to close your thumb part. And because you knitted it back and forth here, there's a gap. At this moment you can also try to see if the thumb hole is big enough. Everybody has a different thumb size, so you could adjust that by knitting 2 extra rows over here. So that's also a way of getting the right size. Well, the strand is coming out of the part of the thumb, as you see here, and then you are going to connect that one to the first one you find on the mitt. This is the in-between strand, so you take a closer look, or an in-between strand, and they are already connected. And then you are going to grab the bar that's above those stitches. You're going to grab it, and you actually do that on the other side as well. So there too, you grab the bar that you see first. After that connection we had between the part of the thumb and the mitt. Actually you see ridges and bars on the side, on both sides, and you can use that to connect such a seam in the right way. And you see that on the other side as well. If you just pull a little bit as you work in yarn, you can see which stitch you last joined, and then you actually grab the bar above that one. In this case it's a ridge. You pull your working yarn through, and then you look for the same thing, a bar or a ridge on the other side. You pull your working yarn through, and so you are joining the two sides together. A needle with a blunt one is quite handy in this case, because you won't get stuck in the stitch. And if you actually look at what happens, then you actually see a knit stitch arise. So it runs nicely into your project, and that's because on both sides of the rib stitch you made a knit stitch, and so you join both sides together in a nice way. So this is a nice way of joining. You already, you see here it's a back and forth knitting part, and you see there is a knit stitch on both sides. But here you see, because you want to close the hole here, and you cast it on a new stitch, so you don't really have those V shapes anymore. There you can go diagonally in the stitch this way, and then you just see if it fits neatly. The other side of the thumb we do the same way, and here you have at some point the middle of the gap exactly. this is exactly the middle stitch, and this is the part where you cast it on the stitch to close the gap for the thumb. So in this case we take half of that middle stitch on the part of the mitt, and one last time on the part of the thumb. Take a look, this is the rib stitch and this is the knit stitch, and as you can see you are just one stitch underneath the rib stitch, and that's what you're actually doing and going to do on the other side as well. You try to get both sides of this thumb part as even as possible. This side we have used without using a new strand to weave in, so no knot. We have used the cast on strand, and this side we are going to do a knot by adding a new strand, and then weave in your strand to the point where you want to start, and there you make a knot. When weaving in, I always use part of the stitch or stitches, so I don't really see it on the outside, so it almost lies on top of it. Okay, in the knot, pull the yarn through, then I have a loop, and then I actually go through the back, and then I pull it tight. And of course you do this on the wrong side of your project. Your needle is still on the wrong side, and you put it near those two stitches you wanted to join. So you take a closer look again. Just like on the other side, this is the connection between, or connection or in between stitch. You're going to one above that one, and then you get your needle from the inside like this way, and then you're going to pull it in the stitch, so the ones you want to connect with each other again. And take a closer look, and you actually do exactly the same as what you did on the other side of the thumb. You look closely. Sometimes it's quite difficult because it's a small stitch. You can take already take the next stitch, and then you pull through. What's also important with mattress stitch is you take into account the tension of your project, because if you would pull at it too hard, so at your thumb part, then it will get a lot smaller, and you might have a problem that it won't fit. Sew up to one stitch beneath the rib stitch, just like on the other side, and in the meantime you always keep your tension in mind. But then when you're done, you can also still adjust the tension. So this will be the last one to connect, and if necessary you just pull on the mitt. Then you have an even better side then, and you can pull the stitches slightly apart. Here you are busy, and here that's the other piece you have already done, and here you have actually used half of the stitch and of that middle piece. So as what you can see here is that middle stitch, and then you had grabbed a part of it, and that's what you're actually going to do with the other side as well. So you are exactly in the middle of your thumb, and if all goes well, you now have two equal sides for the last part of your thumb. Well then, you pull both sides of your thumb a bit, and you adjust your tension a bit so it can't be too tight. And as you can see, it's actually a very nice way. It looks like you've increased there, like you would have done on an adjustable loom. If you want, you can get rid of holes that may have arisen. You can adjust them by looping the stitch a little. By putting on the mitt, you pull a little tension, and you see what happens by pulling on or add a stitch. Then you correct it or adjust it by looping the stitch as much as possible to the middle of the mitt, until the tension is actually like it should be again. And also that you can't see you have looped them through. Fortunately, with those ordinary knit stitches, it's easy to see what happens with it, and with an E-wrap you will have a little more trouble with that. and as you can see, the hole is already a lot less. Look at this other side as well. You also see that hole here. You see a little bar that is a bit larger or bigger, and just search which stitch is connected to it. And just by pulling at 1 or 2 stitches, you quickly see what happens, and then you adjust until you don't see any holes anymore. It's a nice way to get rid of your holes, which are caused by increasing. It doesn't have to be that like that, but it could. Well, your thumb part, you have 2 strands here. You only need 1, so one way you are going to work into the inside. You weave it into your project later when you start weaving in the rest of your tail's ends. If all goes well, both sides are having the same length now, and that strand you just put to the inside, make sure it's out of the way. And then again take a closer look at which ridge or bar starts first, and then you are going to join them together. Just exactly what you did at your thumb part. So you take a good look. There was my last stitch, and that bar up there, that's the first bar I'm going to grab. So you follow the stitch, or actually V shapes, and then you look and you connect them, and so you continue with your thumb part. Actually you connect 2 half of a V shape to make a whole V shape out of it. So 2 halves make 1, and as you can see, you can do already 4 at one time. Here's a bar, that's 2. On the other side you have that one also, and then again a ridge, and that's on the other side as well. And that's how you finish it, doing it or grabbing it alternately until you reach the top. And with the top I mean your cast off edge. It should now run seamlessly into each other. You can also see that the rib stitch merge neatly. We sew up to 1 stitch beneath the cast off edge. And this is a strand, and you look through, and this is your last cast off stitch, and then you look closely at the other side as well. Then you see there that is your cast off edge, and this is actually your first cast off stitch, and you are going to use that one to join it neatly together. If you notice that it doesn't flow into each other, then you grab 2 of those bars halfway at the same time instead of 1, and continue until the very end. Well, you don't actually see a bar to join here anymore. What you do is you pull your needle through your last cast off stitch here, you pull it through, and then you are going to join your cast off stitches with each other in a moment, so they will line up as well. And you go underneath the stitch like here, and then you go back where you came from, and so you create a new V shape on top of that cast off edge, and you adjust it neatly to the rest of the stitches, so it looks just like one cast off edge. Then you have this part ready. You also finish it neatly. I also go 1 stitch down and make a knot behind through it, and you weave it in, or in the V shape or in the ridges. You always grab a part of your ridges so you can see from the outside. If you can't see the needle on the good side, then you weave in the right way. You cut that tail's end to 1 millimeter, you pull at it a little so that it merges neatly into the project. There we have another tail's end. You thread the needle, you take a closer look, and also here you just go 1 stitch down so you can't see anything at all. at the good side. And as always, adjust, check and see if it's neat and tidy, flowing or merging to each other. Again, you finish it neatly, check it, and the other strand you had woven in on the other side of the seam. And now you are going to look for another spot to weave in this tail's end. You cut the strand again, and then you are going to weave in the rest of the tail's ends. This is the top of your thumb part, and you are going to join that as well. You make one piece of it, so it looks like it's just one cast off edge. This is where the strand comes out, you pull it through. And this is actually your first stitch, which is always a bit slanted in relation to the rest. And that one you will join. You make a complete new V shape of it again by taking the strand beneath the first stitch and then go back where you came from. You adjust it and then go one stitch down and you make a knot. And of course, when you have knitted with two strands, you can also weave them in separately. So first you do one strand and then the next one. And you will get less of a bump in the project. Use a part of the stitch or use your old familiar way of weaving ends, because it goes back and forth here with the pulling on and off with the mittens. I'll repeat it another time, and that's also important. Pull it a bit so it becomes one piece, and then you trim it to 1 millimeter, and you check again, and then you look at the other tail's ends. These you actually do in the same way as what you did with your cast off edge. You go inside, you pull the mitt and thumb inside out, and then you check it out again. You will hear me say it a lot of time, check, check, double check. What you also can do with holes that are created, you use your tail's end to make them smaller. You copy your stitch from the wrong side and then you pull at it just a little bit, and then you'll see that the hole on the outside is gone as well. Take a good look at how the stitch runs or goes, and then you take a stitch above it and then you go back to the beginning, from the point where you started. So actually you make a kind of V shape of it, but on the wrong side. You pull a little bit at it and make it a little bit smaller here. If you are constantly watching, checking what's happening, then you can actually adjust your project very nicely with needle and strands, and so with weaving in the ends. So you adjust it just by pulling at it a little bit, and you make a knot to secure it. And again you weave in the ends. I won't use the seam, otherwise you will get a bigger bump over there. So always take the project or just plain knit stitches. And that's the only disadvantage on looms like a Nifty Knitter, that it's a little bit more difficult to increase, and then this is actually a very nice way to solve this problem. Or is it a real problem? Okay, your tail's end again, old and familiar. You cut the strand neat and tidy, and then you start checking it out again. Continuous checking. Thumb out again, and then you just see, what does my project needs or still needs? Can I use the needle to loop it through, or do I just have to use a tail's end for that to solve something? And by doing it this way, we have a thumb pointing diagonally upwards and not at right angles to the mittens, because our hand doesn't look like that either. So this is a nice way to do it. Well, another tail's end. And also here, check what does it need. Can I make my project even more beautiful? Can I still connect it? And you go back in the stitches. Actually, you do exactly what you did with your cast off edge. So under the first stitch, go back again, adjust, make this stitch as big as the other ones, and then one stitch down, and you make a knot to secure, and you weave it in neatly back into your project. And what I've said before, either you use your V shapes or your ridges, just watch or look closely what does my project needs, and you cut off the strand neatly again. All tails ends are finished. You fit it. You check how your thumb fits. If you just notice that it's too tight, you can also choose to take 5 stitches from this spot and do this thumb from there. You could even do rib stitch all the way through with rib stitch. That one has stretch and elasticity enough. And yes, your first one, your first mitt is actually your test piece. And as you can see, this is actually a very nice solution for when you don't have a adjustable loom. And then this is your fingerless mitt, and as you can see, the thumb parts merge nicely into the mid part, and you can have many variations on it. More rows rib stitch, less rows of rib stitch, the mitt all the way in a rib stitch. You can use everything on it. With a stitch like this, you can also add charts or knit them with it in the right way, with intarsia or Fair Isle. You can use your own creative mind to make, and you can try other yarn, other stitches, as long as you know that if you use a different yarn, the mitten will be smaller or larger. So you always have to take that into account when you are going to knit a project like this. And it is a really fun project. Unique mittens. And what you also can do is you knit up to a certain part, to here for example, and you do that on the 24 packs loom, and then you switch to the 31 packs loom. You can still do that, and then you knit up to 10 rows, and then you transfer it to a larger loom. Then you can do that thumb part on the larger loom and transfer it back to a smaller loom. There are many possibilities, and this is what it actually looks like, but that's the fun of knitting. You can create it just the way you want it. You see, I have 2 identical mittens with equally large thumbs, all ready to face the winter again. And now in a moment I will give you a sneak preview from mittens I have knitted after those 2. So mittens with a flap, and I will make another pattern out of it. And these ones I've connected with a button. And here's another one, and there the thumb gap, the part of the thumb is a little bit bigger, and then I sewed the thumb up to the mitten as well. And as you can see, by just knitting a mitten, you can make many variations to it, and you just keep on trying and trying until you have a mitten that fits the right way. And this is how it looks on the inside. So you have a little seam, but you won't feel that. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you next time. Bye bye.